The year is 1941, and the world stands on the brink of unprecedented global conflict. Japan, a rising naval power, believed firmly in the doctrine of the decisive fleet engagement. Their strategy hinged on overwhelming the enemy in a single, climactic battle of behemoths. To fulfill this vision, they secretly commissioned the largest and most powerful battleship ever conceived. This vessel was named the Yamato, a name that evoked the ancient and mythic spirit of Japan itself. She was designed to be the ultimate weapon, a floating fortress that could withstand any attack. The Yamato was an engineering marvel, a testament to human ingenuity and national ambition. Her construction was cloaked in the highest level of secrecy, symbolizing a deeply held strategic advantage. Japanese naval architects poured all their knowledge into creating a ship they genuinely believed was invincible. They designed her armor to repel any shell fired by contemporary battleships from any range. The sheer scale of the project was meant to intimidate and demoralize any potential adversary. The very existence of such a massive, impregnable warship was intended to be a psychological deterrent. The Yamato represented the final, glorious peak of battleship technology, a triumphant climax to a century of naval arms races. For the Imperial Japanese Navy, she was not just a ship, she was the physical embodiment of national prestige and power. Her presence in the fleet was a promise of victory, an assurance that Japan's maritime borders were safe. The entire nation placed immense faith in the protective power and unmatched offensive capability of this single vessel. This faith, however, was born from a doctrine already becoming obsolete in the rapidly changing landscape of modern warfare. The world was changing beneath the colossal keel of the Yamato, but the admirals clung to their old beliefs. They imagined her standing victorious against any foe, dominating the seas as a permanent symbol of Japanese might. The Yamato was built for a war that was no longer being fought, a battle of gun for gun that technology had already rendered a relic. She was a dream in steel, a beautiful, deadly anachronism poised to enter a conflict that would brutally expose her limitations. The stage was set for a dramatic collision between the past and the future of naval warfare. The construction of the battleship Yamato was an engineering feat of astounding secrecy and colossal scale. Work began in 1937 at the Kure Naval Arsenal, one of Japan's most heavily guarded facilities. Massive efforts were undertaken to conceal the true dimensions of the ship from foreign intelligence agencies. A towering fence and thick rope barriers were erected around the dry dock to block any line of sight from the outside. Special canvas awnings were used to cover the growing hull plates as the structure rose above the dock walls. Even the windows of surrounding buildings were covered or frosted to prevent any glimpse of the monumental work in progress. A massive roof was constructed over the building slip to completely obscure the vast battleship during its assembly. The scale required special construction techniques, including the use of unprecedentedly large and powerful cranes. New, enormous welding techniques had to be developed and perfected just to join the colossal steel sections. The main armament, her 18.1-inch guns, were so large they had to be built in separate, secure facilities far from the main shipyard. These guns represented a significant technological leap, designed to outrange and outpunch every other naval gun in existence. When the ship was finally launched in August 1940, the event was conducted with extreme discretion and without public fanfare. The Yamato was floated out under the cover of darkness to maintain the illusion of its smaller, feigned dimensions. The Japanese deliberately spread misinformation, suggesting the ship's size was smaller than it actually was to confuse rivals. This cloak of secrecy was a core part of the ship's psychological value, maximizing the element of surprise. The naval leadership believed that the mere unknown threat of a ship with such overwhelming power would paralyze enemy planners. Workers on the project were subjected to intense security screenings and strict loyalty oaths to ensure absolute silence. The sheer tonnage of steel and resources poured into the Yamato project was a massive drain on the national budget. This one vessel consumed enough material to build several smaller, though arguably more useful, escort carriers. Every part of the design, from the immense bulkheads to the triple expansion engines, was over-engineered for supremacy. The Yamato was a triumph of industrial capability, demonstrating Japan's mastery of pre-war battleship technology. Her secret construction was a metaphor for the entire Japanese war plan, a silent, massive, decisive blow. The heart of the Yamato's formidable reputation lay in her staggering armament and impenetrable armor. She was the only battleship in history to mount 946 cm or 18.1-inch main guns. These weapons were significantly larger and heavier than the 16-inch guns carried by her American and British counterparts. Each of the massive shells weighed over 3,200 pounds, requiring immense energy to project over vast distances. The three main gun turrets were themselves monumental, each weighing more than a typical World War II destroyer. The armor protecting these turrets was nearly 26 inches thick, designed to withstand a direct hit from any opposing battleship. The main armor belt of the hull was also unprecedented, measuring 16 inches of specialized, hardened steel. This belt was carefully sloped to maximize its defensive properties against plunging fire from long range. The ship's complex internal structure featured multiple layers of watertight compartments and anti-torpedo bulges. Naval engineers calculated that the Yamato could survive numerous torpedo hits without sinking. The total displacement of the warship exceeded 72,000 tons, cementing its position as the largest battleship ever built. Her sheer size contributed to a reputation for stability, allowing her to maintain accurate fire even in heavy seas. The powerful engines gave her a top speed of 27 knots, fast for a ship of her immense bulk. This combination of speed, armor, and firepower was designed to guarantee victory in any surface engagement. The secondary armament was also formidable, including numerous 6.1-inch guns in triple turrets. Later in the war, her anti-aircraft defenses were dramatically increased, creating a dense field of smaller caliber weapons. Despite these upgrades, the anti-aircraft defense remained fundamentally flawed, relying on volume rather than accuracy. The Yamato's design was a direct, albeit final, response to the Washington Naval Treaty limitations. She was intended to render every other nation's capital ship obsolete the moment she entered service. The entire vessel was a single-minded instrument for maximum destruction and maximum survivability in a gunnery duel. Her designers never truly envisioned the devastating threat that would come not from the sea, but from the air above. The Yamato was born from the Imperial Japanese Navy's deeply entrenched strategic philosophy known as Kantai Kessen. This phrase, meaning a decisive battle doctrine, was a direct inheritance from naval strategists of the late 19th and early 20th centuries. The doctrine posited that the outcome of a war would be determined by a single, massive, winner-take-all engagement between the main fleets. Admirals believed that a superior force of battleships, armed with heavier guns and greater protection, would inevitably triumph. The Yamato class was the logical, ultimate expression of this belief, designed to smash the American fleet in one fell swoop. Japan's strategic planners anticipated that the U.S. Navy would steam across the Pacific to relieve the Philippines. The Japanese fleet would then engage the Americans in a fierce, staggered line of battle engagement near the home islands. The final, fatal blow would be delivered by the Yamato and her sister ship, the Musashi, ending the war decisively. This strategy was rooted in the successful naval battles of the Russo-Japanese War decades earlier. It fundamentally misunderstood the evolving capabilities of new naval technologies, specifically carrier aviation. The emphasis remained exclusively on the direct power of the battleship's guns and armor. The Navy allocated immense resources to perfecting their big guns and torpedoes, neglecting the nascent field of carrier warfare. Naval tradition and institutional momentum blinded many senior officers to the revolution occurring overhead. The entire design of the Yamato was optimized for surviving a close-range shell exchange, a battle that would never come. The doctrine created an almost religious devotion to the battleship as the primary capital ship. It elevated the Yamato to a near-mythical status, making it seem strategically too valuable to risk in minor skirmishes. This excessive caution, ironically, kept the most powerful weapon out of the early, critical battles of the war. While the strategists waited for the perfect moment for the decisive battle, the nature of war irrevocably changed. The Yamato's design represented an anachronism, a physical manifestation of a tactical worldview that the opening shots of World War II would instantly obliterate. The massive steel warship became a symbol of a strategy waiting for a battle that the enemy had already chosen to avoid. The attack on Pearl Harbor in December 1941 served as a brutal, yet clear, prologue to the new era of naval warfare. Japan's own success demonstrated that air power, launched from mobile aircraft carriers, was the new dominant force. The primary target of the attack was the stationary American battleships, which proved to be catastrophic liabilities. Conversely, the American carriers, absent from the harbor, immediately became the most strategically important assets. Less than 6 months later, the Battle of Midway cemented this paradigm shift with devastating clarity. Four of Japan's most precious fleet carriers were sunk by American naval aircraft in a matter of hours. This crushing defeat was a profound lesson in the vulnerability of fleets that lacked sufficient air cover. The aircraft extended the reach of the fleet's striking power far beyond the range of any battleship gun. A carrier could launch hundreds of miles away and destroy an enemy without ever being seen or engaged by the main fleet. This long-distance, preemptive strike capability instantly rendered the close-range battleship duel obsolete. The Yamato's immense armor, designed for shells, was surprisingly vulnerable to the new threat of aerial torpedoes and bombs. Torpedoes striking below the waterline proved far more lethal to a massive hull than high-angle plunging shellfire. The ship's initial anti-aircraft protection was meager and outdated, a reflection of the low priority assigned to air defense. The Yamato was a ship built to fight horizontally against a ship, but the war was now fought vertically from the sky. The new capital ship was the aircraft carrier, whose massive flight deck was the true measure of naval strength. The battleship was relegated to the secondary role of providing shore bombardment and distant escort duty. This shift was a profound psychological blow to the Japanese naval tradition, which idolized the big gun warship. The admirals struggled to accept that their ultimate weapon had been technologically surpassed before it even fired its guns in anger. The Yamato became the most expensive, most powerful, and arguably most irrelevant warship of its time. Its fate was sealed not by the size of an enemy gun, but by the rapidly evolving design of a small aircraft. The early years of the Pacific War saw the Yamato relegated to a surprisingly passive, almost ceremonial role. Due to its high cost and symbolic value, Naval Command deemed it too precious to risk in early engagements. The battleship was designated the flagship of the combined fleet, a position of prestige rather than combat. For long periods, the massive vessel remained at anchor in the tranquil waters of Truk Lagoon in the Central Pacific. It functioned primarily as a floating headquarters for Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto and his staff. While the critical carrier battles of Coral Sea and Midway were being fought, the Yamato was far from the action. The sailors on board often referred to her as the Yamato Hotel due to the luxury of its spacious accommodations. The crew grew frustrated, feeling a sense of uselessness as the tide of war began to turn against Japan. They were aboard the ultimate weapon, yet they were spectators to the dramatic, carrier-led victories and crushing defeats. This self-imposed exile directly contradicted the Yamato's design purpose of fighting a decisive, close-quarters battle. The strategy of preservation ultimately deprived the fleet of its most heavily armored ship during crucial early war shortages. Had the Yamato been present at Midway, it could not have altered the ultimate outcome, but it would have been a target. Its absence from the early combat meant that Japan did not quickly learn the hard lessons about air defense needed. The flagship remained pristine, a massive symbol of unused potential as the rest of the fleet was slowly attrited. It only fired its main guns in combat for the first time much later, in the distant waters off the Philippines. The ship's very invincibility, the source of its legend, ironically became the cause of its strategic marginalization. The naval leadership refused to sacrifice their symbolic flagship, ensuring that the battles were decided by smaller, faster ships. While the Yamato sat idle, American industry churned out an overwhelming number of new, efficient Essex-class carriers. The decision to hoard the Yamato was a strategic blunder that reflected the Navy's fundamental miscalculation of wartime priorities. The ghostly flagship was a powerful myth, but the war required relentless, practical application of force. The Battle of Midway in June 1942 was the single most pivotal event that invalidated the Yamato's existence. It was a catastrophic defeat for Japan, who lost for irreplaceable fleet carriers in a single day of fighting. The four sunken carriers were the heart of the striking power that had devastated Pearl Harbor. Their loss irrevocably shifted the balance of naval power in the Pacific to the United States. Midway proved beyond any doubt that the fate of a fleet rested entirely on its aerial strength and air combat radius. The decisive action was conducted by dive bombers and torpedo planes, not the heavy shells of battleships. The Yamato, anchored thousands of miles away, could only receive the crushing news of the disaster. The Japanese High Command began to realize the extent of their strategic error, but they were paralyzed by tradition. They were unable to fully pivot away from the battleship concept, even as the evidence mounted. The immediate post-Midway period saw a scramble to rapidly upgrade the anti-aircraft capability of the remaining heavy ships. The Yamato was eventually pulled into a dry dock to receive a massive array of new 25mm anti-aircraft guns. These additions, though numerous, were largely ineffective against the speed and coordination of massed American air attacks. The technological gap was too wide, a defensive solution could not be bolted onto a ship designed for offense. The battle established the operational blueprint for the rest of the war: find the enemy carriers, destroy the air threat. American commanders understood that sinking battleships was a secondary, almost irrelevant, objective. the loss of experienced flight crews and aircraft mechanics further compounded Japan's problem after Midway. The U.S. Navy, meanwhile, rapidly replaced its losses and began an industrial surge of ship and plane production. Midway was the point of no return, a brutal demonstration that massed airpower had broken the century-old code of naval engagement. The Yamato was now trapped in a hostile ocean, an immense, slow-moving target with an inadequate shield. The battle forced Japan to confront the reality that their naval doctrine had failed catastrophically. The Battle of Leyte Gulf in October 1944 was the last desperate attempt by the Japanese Navy to turn the tide. It remains the largest naval battle in history, a sprawling, chaotic engagement across the Philippine Sea. The Yamato was finally committed to major combat as the centerpiece of Vice Admiral Kurita's massive center force. Its mission was to break through the American defenses and attack the vulnerable invasion fleet anchored off Leyte. In the early morning hours, the Yamato fired its massive 18.1-inch guns in anger for the first time at enemy surface ships. The target was a small group of lightly armed American escort carriers and destroyers, codenamed Taffy 3. It was a brief, brutal surface action, far different from the decisive battle the Yamato was designed to fight. The sheer power of the battleship's guns was undeniable, causing chaos and destruction among the American escort vessels. One of the ship's massive shells struck the American escort carrier Gambier Bay, contributing to its sinking. The Yamato narrowly avoided a catastrophic torpedo attack from the American destroyers which charged her head-on. The overwhelming courage of the American destroyers and destroyer escorts was enough to sow confusion and delay the Japanese fleet. Crucially, the center force became convinced they were engaging the American fleet carriers, which was an incorrect assessment. Admiral Kurita, facing fierce resistance and the loss of several heavy cruisers, made the fateful decision to retreat. This decision was influenced by the earlier, devastating aerial attacks that had already crippled his force. The retreat allowed the vulnerable American landing ships to escape complete destruction at the last minute. The Yamato survived the battle, taking a few bomb hits but remaining operationally intact. It proved that in a traditional surface engagement, the ship was still a monster of the sea. However, the battle's overall outcome was a crushing Japanese defeat, crippling their remaining naval power. The Yamato's brief moment of surface engagement was overshadowed by the dominance of American airpower throughout the entire battle. By April 1945, the war was nearing its end, and American forces were landing on Okinawa, Japan's last major defense. The surviving Imperial Japanese Navy assets were few, and the air arm was virtually non-existent. In a final act of desperation and defiance, the High Command authorized Operation Tengo, a suicide mission. The goal was for the Yamato, along with a small escort of light cruisers and destroyers, to sortie to Okinawa. They were ordered to beach themselves on the island and act as an immovable, devastating shore battery until destroyed. The objective was not survival or victory, but a glorious and honorable death to inspire the remaining defenders. Crucially, the fleet was only given enough fuel for a one-way trip, cementing the mission's suicidal nature. The captains and crews knew with absolute certainty that they would not be returning to Japan. The atmosphere on board was a mixture of resignation, fatalism, and a fierce, final devotion to duty. The Yamato set sail on April 6, leaving the home port of Tokayama Bay and heading south into the East China Sea. American submarine and air reconnaissance quickly detected the massive warship and its accompanying vessels. The U.S. Task Force 58 immediately began preparing the largest coordinated air attack in naval history. Admiral Raymond Spruance refused to commit his own battleships, understanding the air threat was the superior option. The Americans chose to rely entirely on their overwhelming carrier-borne air power to eliminate the threat. The operation was a stark final admission by the Japanese that their grand battleship was a strategic liability. The Yamato, the symbol of naval supremacy, was reduced to a mobile, massive target for American planes. The final voyage was a quiet, solemn procession toward an inevitable and violent end. The great ship was steaming directly into a storm of steel and fire from above, the only battle it could not win. On the morning of April 7, 1945, the American planes found the Yamato southwest of Kyushu. A massive strike force, involving over 300 aircraft, was launched in continuous waves from multiple U.S. carriers. The attacking force included Hellcat fighters, Helldiver dive bombers, and Avenger torpedo bombers. The first wave of planes reached the doomed fleet around noon, initiating a coordinated, relentless assault. The American pilots were instructed to concentrate their attacks on one side of the battleship to increase the flooding and induce a capsize. The sky around the Yamato erupted in a terrifying, dense cloud of anti-aircraft fire from its numerous guns. The air defenses were intense, but they were wildly inaccurate against the fast-moving, diving aircraft. Torpedo bombers executed low-level runs, aiming for the ship's vulnerable area below the waterline. Dive bombers struck the decks and superstructures with high-explosive bombs, destroying fire control and gun emplacements. The first torpedoes quickly found their mark, causing rapid flooding and initiating a heavy list to port. The sheer number of attacking aircraft overwhelmed the Japanese gunners, leading to exhaustion and panic. Wave after wave of American planes kept arriving, pressing the attack with surgical precision and brutal efficiency. The ship's secondary 6.1-inch guns were eventually rendered useless as they were flooded by seawater. The crew was fighting fires and desperately trying to counter flood compartments to correct the severe listing. The damage was compounding rapidly, turning the proud warship into a struggling, burning hulk. The Japanese pilots who managed to take off and provide air cover were quickly shot down by the escorting American fighters. The Yamato's captain, knowing the end was near, ordered the final, futile efforts to save the magnificent vessel. The enormous ship, designed to be unsinkable, was now crippled and wallowing in the waves. The torrent of American ordnance proved too much for even the colossal Yamato's formidable structure. By the second hour of the attack, the battleship had sustained at least 8 bomb hits and a dozen torpedo strikes. The massive hull, designed to withstand shells, was simply not designed to absorb this volume of underwater damage. The coordinated torpedo hits on the port side had rendered the counter-flooding efforts completely ineffective. Water poured into the engine rooms and boiler compartments, silencing the mighty engines and slowing the ship to a crawl. The sheer volume of flooding led to a list of over 20 degrees, making the main guns impossible to operate. Around 2:05 p.m., the order was given to abandon ship as the captain realized the situation was hopeless. The ship's last operational gun, a single 6.1-inch weapon, fired one final, desperate shell at the retreating planes. As the list increased to over 80 degrees, the entire 68,000-ton bulk began to capsize and roll over. The masts and superstructure scraped the water as the ship's bottom rose into the sky. At 2:20 p.m., disaster struck in the form of a catastrophic, terminal explosion deep within the hull. It is believed that the tremendous pressure from the capsizing caused the magazine of the forward main turret to detonate. The resulting blast was absolutely titanic, launching a mushroom cloud over 3 miles into the air. Eyewitnesses aboard the American aircraft described the column of smoke and fire as an apocalyptic sight. The concussion from the explosion was so violent that it was felt on the American ships dozens of miles away. The explosion tore the enormous battleship apart, sending pieces of her hull soaring high into the sky. The Yamato quickly sank, plunging over 2,000 sailors into the churning, oily water below. The vast majority of the crew, including the captain and Admiral Saiki Ito, perished in the devastating final moments. The sinking was swift, brutal, and a definitive demonstration of Airpower's absolute superiority. The violent, spectacular sinking of the Yamato marked the irreversible end of the battleship era. The ship, conceived as the ultimate arbiter of naval power, was vanquished not by another ship, but by aircraft. Its destruction signaled the final, undisputed supremacy of the aircraft carrier as the capital ship of the world's navies. The Yamato became a powerful symbol of a nation's misguided belief in the permanence of outdated technology. It represented a monumental investment in a weapon made obsolete by a faster, more flexible concept. No nation would ever again build a warship of the battleship's size or class after this definitive demonstration. The lessons of the Yamato's fate were absorbed by naval architects around the globe for decades to come. Future naval design focused overwhelmingly on air defense, speed, and the projection of carrier-based power. The wreck of the Yamato lies today on the seabed, a massive, broken monument to technological overreach. The ship remains an object of intense fascination, representing the tragic intersection of pride, power, and obsolescence. The story of the Yamato is a cautionary tale about the dangers of clinging to tradition in the face of rapid technological evolution. Its myth of invincibility was irrevocably shattered by the combined might of hundreds of American aircraft. The battleship was simply an enormous target, lacking the necessary speed and anti-air defense to survive in the modern war zone. Its sacrifice was a futile gesture, one final, desperate commitment to a doctrine that had already failed. The explosion that tore the Yamato apart was the final, concussive punctuation mark on the century-long reign of the big gun. From that day forward, the world's oceans would belong to the fast, mobile, and air-capable fleet. The legend of the Yamato persists, not as a champion of the seas, but as the magnificent, tragic casualty of a naval revolution.